15 Comanche warriors don't just appear at your dinner table by accident. They come for blood, for justice, or for something far more dangerous than either. And Jonas Crow McKenna was about to discover which one it was. But let's go back to where this impossible story began. Just 3 hours earlier, the Texas sun was setting like a dying ember over McKenna's modest spread, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that reminded him why he'd chosen this godforsaken piece of land in the first place. At 38, Jonas had been eating his evening meal alone for 7 years, ever since the fever took his wife Sarah and their boy Tommy. The silence had become his only companion, broken only by the occasional coyote call or the whisper of wind through the mesquite. He was halfway through his usual supper of beans and hardtack when he first heard them. Not the sound of approaching horses that most men would expect, but something far more unsettling. The complete absence of sound. No crickets chirping, no cattle lowing in the distance, no night birds calling. The kind of silence that meant predators were near. Jonas set down his tin fork and reached for the Winchester propped against the wall. 7 years of solitude had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming danger. He moved to the window and peered through the gap in the shutters, expecting to see wolves or maybe a mountain lion prowling near his livestock. What he saw instead made his blood turn to ice. 15 Comanche warriors sat motionless on their horses in a perfect circle around his cabin. They weren't painted for war, weren't carrying weapons at the ready, weren't making any of the threatening gestures he'd learned to fear during his years as an army scout. They were just sitting there watching his cabin with the patient stillness of men who had all the time in the world. Jonas had seen enough Indian raids to know this wasn't one. Raiders struck fast and hard, using surprise and terror as weapons. These men were doing something else entirely, something that scared him far more than any war party ever could. The leader sat directly in front of his door, close enough that Jonas could see the intricate beadwork on his shirt and the eagle feather in his hair. When the man spoke, his voice carried clearly through the evening air, speaking English with only the slightest accent. "Jonas McKenna, we know you are inside. We have not come to make war with you. We have come to eat." Jonas felt his throat go dry. In all his years on the frontier, he'd never heard of Comanche warriors politely requesting dinner. It had to be some kind of trap, a new tactic designed to get him to lower his guard. But as he watched them through the window, he realized something that made the situation even more bizarre. These weren't young hot bloods looking for glory or seasoned warriors seeking revenge. Some of them looked barely old enough to ride, while others had silver threading through their black hair. It was like they'd gathered representatives from every age and rank in their society. "We know you eat alone every night," the leader continued. "We know you have done so for 7 winters. Tonight, that changes." Jonas pressed his back against the cabin wall, his mind racing. How could they possibly know his personal habits? More importantly, what did they want? The smart thing would be to barricade the door and wait for them to leave. The safe thing would be to fire a warning shot and hope they decided he wasn't worth the trouble. But something in the leader's voice, a weariness that seemed to echo his own loneliness, made him hesitate. And in that moment of hesitation, he made the decision that would change everything. Jonas unbarred his door and stepped onto the porch, his rifle held low, but ready. The sight that greeted him was even more surreal up close. 15 of the most feared warriors on the southern plains, sitting like dinner guests, waiting for an invitation. The leader dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He was a man in his 40s with the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard winters and harder battles. But his eyes held something Jonas hadn't expected: intelligence, yes, but also a deep sadness that seemed to mirror his own. "I am Joseph Crow Feather," the man said, stepping closer. "These are my brothers, my sons, my nephews. We have traveled far to share your table." "Why?" Jonas asked, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "Because sometimes a man can starve even when his belly is full. Because loneliness is a sickness that kills as surely as any bullet. And because tonight, for reasons you will understand soon enough, none of us should eat alone." Joseph gestured toward the other warriors, and for the first time, Jonas noticed what he'd missed before. Despite their stoic expressions, these men looked tired. Not physically exhausted, but soul-weary in a way he recognized from his own reflection in the mirror. "What aren't you telling me?" Jonas asked. Joseph's expression grew even more grave. 3 days ago, the last free Comanche band in Texas was driven onto the reservation. We are what remains 15 men who chose exile over surrender. Tonight is our final meal as free warriors. Tomorrow we ride north to die fighting the bluecoats rather than live as prisoners. The words hit Jonas like a physical blow. He'd heard rumors about the final roundups, but he'd been too isolated to know the details. These weren't raiders or war parties. They were the last remnants of a dying way of life, saying goodbye to everything they'd ever known. "Why here?" Jonas asked. "Why my table?" "Because 7 years ago, you showed mercy to a Comanche child who had wandered onto your land. You fed him, gave him water, and sent him safely back to his people instead of taking him prisoner or worse." Joseph's eyes met his. "That child was my grandson. And because of your kindness, he lived to see his 13th winter." Jonas felt his legs go weak. He remembered the incident vaguely, a young boy, maybe 8 or 9, who'd appeared at his well one scorching summer day. The kid had been half dead from thirst and heat exhaustion. Jonas had given him food and water, let him rest in the shade, then pointed him toward the nearest Comanche camp. "I never knew," Jonas said quietly. "A kindness freely given is never forgotten," Joseph replied. "And tonight, we repay that debt by ensuring that you do not spend your last peaceful evening alone." "Last peaceful evening?" Joseph's expression darkened. "The cavalry unit that drove us from our lands, they are riding this way. They will reach your cabin by dawn, searching for any sign of our passage. When they find none, they may decide that you have been harboring Comanche fugitives." Jonas felt ice forming in his stomach. "Are you saying they'll assume I helped you?" "Well, Captain Marcus Thornton commands that unit. He is a man who sees enemies everywhere and asks questions only after the shooting stops. If he finds any evidence that we were here—" Joseph didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The other warriors began dismounting, moving with the fluid grace of men who'd spent their lives on horseback. Up close, Jonas could see the family resemblances, the way certain features repeated across generations, the shared mannerisms that spoke of blood bonds forged over centuries. "So why are you here?" Jonas asked. "If being here puts me in danger, why come at all?" "Because running away would be an insult to the kindness you showed my grandson. Because hiding would make us cowards. And because sometimes, when the world is ending, the only honorable thing to do is face it with dignity." Joseph paused, studying Jonas's face. "The question is, Jonas McKenna, will you share your last peaceful meal with 15 dead men?" Jonas looked at these warriors who had chosen to include him in their final ritual rather than hide in the shadows. Men who were about to ride to certain death rather than accept the slow death of reservation life. Men who remembered a single act of kindness from 7 years ago and had come to repay it with the most precious thing they had left, their time. "I'll need to cook more beans," he said finally. The meal that followed was unlike anything Jonas had ever experienced. 15 Comanche warriors crowded into his small cabin, sitting on his floor, sharing his simple food as if it were a feast fit for chiefs. They spoke in low voices, sometimes in English, sometimes in their own language, telling stories of hunts and battles, of loved ones lost and memories treasured. Joseph sat beside Jonas, translating when needed, explaining the significance of certain tales. Gray Wolf is telling about the last buffalo hunt, he said, as one of the older warriors gestured expansively. He killed 3 bulls with 3 arrows, enough meat to feed his extended family for a month. When was this? Jonas asked. 15 years ago. There are no more buffalo now. Another warrior, barely out of his teens, spoke of his first raid, his voice carrying pride and sadness in equal measure. Joseph translated, Swift Eagle says he counted coup on 7 enemies and took no scalps. He wanted to prove his courage without taking lives unnecessarily. What happened to him? Jonas asked, though he suspected he already knew. The soldiers shot him 2 days ago. He died this morning, but his spirit will ride with us tomorrow. Jonas felt something break inside his chest. These men weren't talking about the distant past. They were eulogizing their entire world, their entire way of life, as if it were already dead. As the evening wore on, the stories became more personal. Fathers spoke of children they would never see grow up. Sons talked about mothers they were leaving behind on reservations hundreds of miles away. Brothers remembered siblings who had chosen surrender over death. Why choose this? Jonas asked Joseph during a lull in the conversation. Why die fighting when you could live on the reservation? Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands turning his coffee cup slowly. Have you ever seen a caged eagle, Jonas McKenna? Can't say that I have. It lives, it eats, it exists from day to day. But it is no longer an eagle. It is simply a creature that once knew how to fly. Joseph met his eyes. We are not creatures that can live in cages, even comfortable ones. Around midnight, the stories began to turn darker. These weren't just reminiscences, they were confessions. Warriors spoke of their regrets, their failures, their sins. Men who had killed in anger rather than necessity, leaders who had made decisions that cost lives, fathers who had failed their children. It is our way, Joseph explained quietly. Before a man dies, he must speak the truth about his life, the good and the bad, the courage and the cowardice. Only then can he face death with honor. When it came Jonas's turn to speak, he found himself talking about things he'd never said aloud. About how he'd failed to save Sarah from the fever, about how he'd withdrawn from the world after losing Tommy, about the 7 years of loneliness and self-imposed exile that had turned him into a ghost haunting his own life. I stopped living when they died, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've just been existing, waiting for something to end the waiting. And now? Joseph asked gently. Jonas looked around at these men who had chosen to spend their final hours with him, who had shared their stories and their food and their grief. Now I think maybe I've been waiting for the wrong thing. As dawn approached, the warriors began preparing to leave. They moved with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this before, checking weapons, adjusting saddles, saying silent goodbyes to the place that had given them their last taste of peace. Joseph was the last to mount his horse. He looked down at Jonas with something that might have been affection. You will tell our story? Who would believe it? The truth does not require belief to remain true. Joseph gathered his reins. Take care, Jonas McKenna. You have given us a great gift tonight, the chance to die as men rather than animals. What gift did you give me? Jonas asked. Joseph smiled, the first genuine smile Jonas had seen from him. The chance to live as a man again. The 15 riders disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness as silently as they had arrived, leaving Jonas standing alone on his porch with the taste of their coffee still in his mouth and their stories still echoing in his ears. 3 hours later, Captain Thornton arrived with 40 cavalry troopers, their faces grim and their weapons ready. They searched Jonas's property thoroughly, looking for any sign of the Comanche fugitives they'd been tracking. You see any Indians pass through here? Thornton demanded, his pale eyes cold and suspicious. No, sir, Jonas replied. meeting the captain's gaze steadily. Been quiet as a grave around here. It wasn't technically a lie. The men who had shared his dinner were no longer Comanche warriors, they were legends riding toward their destiny. Thornton's search turned up nothing. How could it? 15 ghosts leave no tracks. After the cavalry left, Jonas stood in his empty cabin, looking at the places where his visitors had sat. The silence felt different now, not the oppressive weight of isolation, but the comfortable quiet of a man who was no longer alone with his memories. He began planning changes to his life. Maybe he'd ride into town more often, reconnect with neighbors he'd been avoiding. Maybe he'd find ways to help people instead of just hiding from them. Maybe he'd remember how to live instead of just survive. 2 days later, news reached the settlement that 15 Comanche warriors had been found dead on the plains north of town. They'd been arranged in a perfect circle, their weapons at their sides, facing outward toward the 4 directions. The cavalry reported that they'd fought bravely to the end, selling their lives dearly. But Jonas knew better. Those men hadn't died fighting, they'd died free. And sometimes in a world that offered few choices, that was the same thing. Years later, when Jonas was an old man surrounded by the family he'd eventually found the courage to build, he would tell the story of the night 15 warriors came to dinner. His grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, hardly believing that such things were possible. But Jonas remembered every detail, the taste of the coffee, the sound of their voices, the weight of their stories. He remembered how 15 men facing death had taught him how to live. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was just right, he could swear he heard the sound of horses riding across the plains, carrying warriors toward a horizon where courage and honor still meant something. If you're loving these incredible true stories from the American frontier, hit that subscribe button because we've got so many more tales of courage, honor, and unlikely friendships waiting for you. Stories that prove that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with compassion and understanding. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video.